Stan Lee has passed away at 95 years old. As many of you know, today is day that many of us have dreaded. Stan Lee has passed away at the age of 95. He leaves behind a legacy of superheroes and stories that have touched many people's lives for decades. We wanted to make this thread to honor and remember this wonderful man, so please use it. Discuss his life, his work, his cameos, etc. and what they meant to you. Excelsior, the AskReddit mobs.
Iranian Genius says, for your information to those who are reporting this, and GT, breaking news, megathreads, and mod posts are exempt from Rule 1 and 2 as they serve a separate purpose to the sub compared to regular post source. Thank you for your civility, and for being kind to the other human beings in this subreddit. Best wishes.
Slightly Alcoholic says, not only did this man create an empire that almost everyone loves, but he was a genuine man who just loved to see people smile. I had the pleasure of working under him for some pop culture conventions, and all he wanted was to see fans smile and enjoy his legacy. He loved to joke with those around him, and he would tease the ever-loving hell out of everyone he could. I remember him using his motorized scooter to get around backstage, and his poor assistant would speed walk to keep up with him, but he would just keep increasing the speed until she was running beside him. A wicked grin on his face the whole time. Or how he would constantly make his staff repeat themselves, "What, I didn't hear you," until they had repeated themselves 4 times. Witnessing that initially made me sad, thinking his hearing was poor, until he looks at me with that same grin and winks. My time with him was short, but I'm so glad I got it. This man changed my life before I even met him, and he made a huge impact when I did as well. R.I.P. Stan.
Deleted, says was really hoping he'd get to see Avengers 4, but at least he did get to see and interact with his creations on the big screen. R.I.P. Deleted, replies he filmed his cameos years in advance just for this situation. He'll be in the next 2 for sure.
Ace Zinez says his wife passed away not too long ago, too. It must have been lonely to all of a sudden be without his life partner.
But a museum says a friend and I snuck into a premiere party for a movie. That's an R-act-licky-oblong story on its own. But we spotted Stan Lee, surrounded by a posse, a lot of pretty girls and some serious handlers. Here we were, just average idiots in a place we weren't supposed to be. We approached, just wanting to say hello and thank him for his work. The handlers were not having any of it and started to move us along. He stopped the handlers and said hello to us. I got to shake his hand and thanked him. He asked if we had cameras. I was kinda dumbstruck by the moment, and forgot cameras existed. He actually wanted to pose for pictures with us, still have the photo, and a nice memory of a pretty great guy who was good to his fans. Edit, https://i.imgur.com/vfrhi78.jpg.
American Honeycrisp says he was the highest-grossing actor of all time if you include cameos and supporting actors.
Colotour HH says, seriously, there was a thread in here I was reading earlier on today about who you can't believe is still alive, and someone mentioned Stan Lee. No frickin' way.
Staminadrain says, I'm 40 plus years of age. When I was growing up, all the Marvel comics I read featured Stan's soapbox, a short column where he would write about whatever was on his mind. It was like a personal letter every month, and always did such a good job of welcoming all into this little club of misfits and widows. Stan is different than most of my heroes in that when I think of him, I'm always 13 again.
Chilabasso says, I guess over the next few years we will see how many future cameos were filmed early. It will be nice to still see him and know that there is more to look forward to.
Humbucking of LOL says, my Stan Lee story: about 4 to 5 years ago, I was in Chicago going to school for animation. Comic-Con was in town, but I had to work and didn't have the money to go anyways. I worked at Dunkin' Donuts and got good with the owner, so I was basically his errand boy. I was delivering bagels and donuts to another store on foot. I was standing at the corner of Wabash and another street, forgot the name, waiting for the light so I could catch a train to another part of downtown. Next to me was this old man with white hair and shades. I am a pretty talkative person, but instead I found myself just staring at him. He caught me staring and raised his eyebrows at me. I apologized and explained that he just looked so familiar. He winked at me and said, "I get it a lot." Turned and walked away. About an hour later I found out Stan Lee was in Chicago for that Comic-Con, and I've been kicking myself ever since. He was up there with Toriyama Akira and Hayao Miyazaki for me. The people I've always wanted to just sit down with and drink coffee. I'd really like to hear yours too if you have them.
Angela0040 says goodbye to a great mind. Between him and Hawking it's been a terrible year. Both changed the world in their own ways.
Cameron Marsh says, since I grew up with superheroes and their ideas of morals, protecting the innocent, I feel like it really shaped me morally, and gave me an interest in criminology and upholding the law. R.I.P. Stan Lee.
Deleted, says this sounds pretty stereotypical, but it means a lot to me. I grew up in a family with 2 alcoholic parents and likely abuse-related early onset mental illness. My reality was incredibly bleak from a very young age. One day, I got my hands on an anthology of the original Amazing Spider-Man comics. Every morning and every night when I got home from school I cracked open that anthology and read each and every comic again and again and again. Stan Lee gave me a healthy escape to a world where all loose ends tied up nicely, where the bad guys always lost, where I knew I was safe. Rest in peace, Mr. Lee. Thank you for everything you've done for me and the likely tens of thousands like me. Deleted, says I'll repeat in what I said in another thread but shortly. He used his platform for selfless purposes and he always stood up for the minority in the face of bigotry. Captain America fought Nazis. Iron Man was an alcoholic war vet. The X-Men represented those who had been misunderstood and cast out by society and its all too alienating standards. Power Man, a black man whose skin was his power, defended Harlem. Rest in peace, Stan Lee. You were awesome.
Broken Community says, damn, one last cameo in Endgame made me cry. And X200B. R.I.P. to a real one.
The Angry Alt says, MODS, can we please ban those who are still alive posts? This tragedy could have been avoided.
Blue Dog 96,729 says, I hope the children who fought and bickered over his money don't see a dime.
Zora 894 says, the year was 2008. I was a high school senior at a college preparation workshop. The instructor presented a quick essay prompt: write about who you are. Having been amazed and greatly inspired by the very first MCU movie just recently, I pulled off the top of my head, I am Iron Man. This went on to become the basis of my admissions essay, and I owe my choice to pursue a career in engineering to Tony Stark. Thank you, Stan Lee.
I once was legend says I always loved superheroes, and my childhood was filled with Marvel. Spider-Man was always my favorite, because I was a weird kid and found spiders fascinating. I loved him more as I grew up, because there were so many similarities. Raised in poor families beset by financial troubles, quick with jokes to cover insecurities, a deep love of science that shaped everything I did, the implicit knowledge that I may not be the strongest, or the toughest, or the most resilient, but that I always had to stand back up, intellectually gifted and, with it, a compulsory, driving need to use that to help people. It's why I became a scientist researching psychiatric illnesses, and then later Alzheimer's disease, because I recognized that I had a gift, and so I had a responsibility. Spider-Man is paper and ink, but he is an ideal I always have, and always will, aspire to. He is my hero, and the man who helped give me that ideal, who shaped so much of my childhood and identity, has died, and the world is a sadder place. Thank you, Stan Lee. Thank you for your heroes and your dreams. Thank you for helping shape me into the person I am. Excelsior.
S0Cow5H says, I know it's silly to mourn public figures who you never personally knew, and obviously my grief pales in comparison to the grief of his loved ones, but this one, and I would too, really got to me. I knew Stan Lee before I knew who the hell he was. He was the guy with the cool voice who narrates my Spider-Man game on N64 when I was a child. It wasn't until years later that I learned it was his voice, but even before then I learned the name of Stan Lee. He helped create my favorite superhero, Spider-Man. He gave my father a line of comics to pass down to me and form a closer connection between the two of us. And he created a character who taught me that I'm not powerless just because I was a kid. While it's easy to write off comic books as a child's entertainment medium, his work really did have a lasting impact on my life. and that impact has in turn helped me touch the lives of others with his works. I never discuss this outside of my clinical setting, but I use the themes and tropes of Spider-Man in my practice to help clients, many of whom are not particularly intellectual, understand concepts like codependency and hero complexes. Thanks to Stan, I'm able to explain very complex ideas to my clients and help them overcome what I've come to call Peter Parker syndrome. So, even beyond his personal impact on my own life, I owe Stan Lee a great debt. His is an influence that will be missed. Marvel games, movies, and media at large will simply not be the same without him. Through the act of creating superheroes, Stan Lee himself became a superhero, a household name that influenced generations of people all around the world. May he rest in peace, but may his legacy continue to resonate with men and women of all ages for generations to come. Edit. Since people were asking what Peter Parker syndrome is, I'll copy-paste my response here. It's an allegory I use to illustrate certain themes. It's how I explain codependency and hero complex to clients. I started by introducing Spider-Man and his real identity. I outlined to my client that, once Peter gets his powers, he goes all in on being Spider-Man. A running theme in the books is that Spider-Man is the real identity, and Peter Parker is the disguise. Anyway, Peter goes all in on being Spider-Man, and it starts to fuck with his life. He loses his girlfriend, drops out of school, loses his job, and loses touch with family. But he doesn't care, because he gets to be the hero and that's what matters most to him. Time passes, and a villain shows up, wipes the floor with Spider-Man. Then he realizes that the one thing he cares about, being the hero, he can't even do anymore. In some storylines, he gives up and puts away the costume. Slowly but surely, he rebuilds his life. He starts dating again, re-enlists in school, gets a new job, starts having hobbies again, and for the first time in a long time, Peter is happy. Then the villain comes back. In the absence of anyone else who can help, he inevitably puts the mask back on and fights, and he wins. And what he learns, and then unlearns because the universe is reset, is that, in order to be a good Spider-Man, he has to be a good Peter Parker. And when Peter suffers, so does Spider-Man. I then relate the client's self-care to their Peter Parker and their desire to be there and care for others to their Spider-Man, to illustrate that they cannot engage in the selfless acts they want to if they do not take care of themselves first. A seemingly simple idea that a lot of my clients struggle to wrap their head around. I then have them keep a running tab of how Peter Parker is doing each day to find gaps in self-care.
Zyke Stain says Stan Lee dying is like David Attenborough or the Queen dying. I refuse to believe it's possible until it is.
Balloonguy9 says I know I'm late to this post, but I met him when I was 17, shook his hand and asked him some questions and had a muffin with him. He is my hero. I didn't have the most active male role models in my life and I used comics to fill that void. I learned more from Spider-Man about responsibilities than anyone. I learned all about racism at a young age through X-Men, and I learned patriotism and to always fight the good fight through Captain America. Of course I learned weird things like don't go through space portals or don't inject yourself with a weird virus as your girlfriend tries to kill you. But most importantly I learned there is others out there like me who also were alone and needed someone. I grew up when it was still lame to be a nerd and I was bullied for knowing what the circle in Iron Man's chest was. My first fist fight was over Spider-Man. My first memory of my dad is him reading me West Coast Avengers. To Stan Lee, thank you. You helped me grow up and become a much better person than I would have become without you. I owe you so much and it hurts I couldn't give you more than a smile when we met. But he called me a true believer. So to all the other true believers out there, keep believing in yourself and others. I love you all.
Deleted, says I knew it was going to happen eventually, given how he was going on in his 90s. The man has lived a very fulfilling life. He got to see all of his creations come to life through Marvel Studios. He got to play minor roles in them as well. Spider-Man, Hulk, X-Men, Daredevil, Captain America, Iron Man, Avengers getting together for the first time ever and many more. The man has lived a very creative life and breathed superheroes. I'm sad he's gone, but in such a large legacy left behind, all of his creative works will live on.
Jacob still says Marvel comics were my childhood and even now are a huge part of my adulthood. His amazing stories enthralled me as a kid and continue to inspire me as an adult. Me and my generation will be forever grateful to this man's imagination. Through the genre of superheroes he spurred our interest in technology and science, opened our eyes to prejudice and bigotry, and permeated lessons of morality and basic human decency. Stan made it a priority that most Marvel superheroes also show a degree of vulnerability, and also in many cases, X-Men, Spider-Man, show them doing the right thing and getting absolutely nothing out of it. Peter Parker would still be broke and mutants would still be persecuted against. This truly is a sad day, but given all of the allegations of elder abuse, I'm glad he's at peace now. His legend will live on forever. Rest well, true believer. Adrobe 2003 says, you know, it's funny. Stan Lee was a person who brought people together. He wasn't just some comic book writer, he was the comic book writer. IDC, if you were a jock, nerd, goth, prep, everyone single person knew his name and loved him for what he was able to accomplish in his very long, very successful life. 95 years old, still acting, still being able to do the things he did with as clear of a mind as his. Today is a day that we lost not only a very loved person, but today we lost the greatest comic book hero ever to live.
Lara Wood says late diagnosed dyslexia and attention deficit disorder meant I could read at the age of 8. That is until my mom bought me a stack of Marvel comics. Stan is my hero because if it wasn't for him I would be illiterate. My biggest regret in life is that when I met the man I froze and couldn't tell him this. I now teach English.
Destroyer of Worlds Y says they should make Stan Lee's birthday a national holiday. Hudson 1212 says god fucking damn it. The Queen better stick it out to 2020. His comics were so fucking enjoyable. Another great loss.
Skoimum says, I wonder if he already filmed his cameo for Avengers 4 and if they will include it still.
Visual Butterfly says, Mr. Lee, thank you for being my escape from reality. I remember watching X-Men cartoons when I was little and being so fascinated by it. Then I started buying the comics, watched the movies, and now it's a big part of who I am. A quote you said about X-Men was, I wanted them to be different. The whole underlying principle of the X-Men was to try to be an anti-bigotry story to show there's good in every person. You made me believe that hope. The world won't be the same without your incredible presence. Rest in peace and love.
Reality ZZ says, God damn it, it's been 5 months and I'm still not over it once I see a post about him passing away.
Sigmund Freud says the guy created characters that served as father figures for kids who didn't have one in their lives. Provided pillars of morality and courage for many people. Can't you imagine how many people battle depression, anxiety and suicidal thoughts by thinking, if Cap can fight in the name of good and the truth, I can make it one more day. Thank you, Stan Lee. May you R.I.P.
Crispy Crunch Hero says he has a legendary legacy that will live on forever. Twitching Jappy says, damn, I really wanted him to make it to 100.
Bakot says he was born in 1922. Ottoman Empire exited until 1922. They also just finished building the Lincoln Memorial in 1922. Weimar Republic, British Empire, all those were still a thing back in 1922, living to the age of 95, having a hugely successful career and all. Sounds like he had a great life.
Jim Beaschity says, I was a young gay kid that was bullied all the time. The world of comic books were an escape for me. Many days sitting alone and escaping to the works of Stan Lee. I remember reading a Hulk comic, where the Hulk didn't care that a character was HIV positive and saved him when no one else would. Thanks Stan Lee, the characters you created were my friends and heroes when I had none.
Sir John Snow says, honestly a large adult male in his 40s, almost broke when his cameo came up in Spider-Verse, especially because of why his character shows up and what he says. Heroic sacrifices are a weakness of mine.
Quinstopper says Stan Lee's creativity was inspirational to me for as long as I can remember. The characters and stories that he had a part in bringing to life have helped in the creation of some of my favorite memories and relationships. He was able to live a long, prosperous life from what it seemed, and I can only hope that his final moments were painless. If I had to guess, I would think that he is enjoying himself up in the cosmos. Excelsior, and thank you for everything you did, Stan.
Ozrox Socks says, years ago, right after Disney bought Marvel, my wife and I were visiting a friend for lunch at the Walt Disney Studios in Burbank. We were walking around and we saw Stan walking with a bunch of suits. We asked to take a photo and he was so happy to meet us and take a photo with us. He was warm, kind and inviting. He talked to us while the executives stood there looking at their watches. He was genuinely happy to talk with us and spend that little time with us. 2 years later, we went to SDCC and printed that photo. We knew it was a long shot to run into him at SDCC, but we would be upset if we missed an opportunity. We found a booth that was hosting Stan. They had Spider-Man guitars and if you bought one, Stan would sign them. We get there and there is this huge crowd. Stan comes and starts signing. My wife and I take out the photo in the middle of the crowd and hold it up high. After 10 minutes or so of signing, surrounded by people holding comics up to get him to sign, he spots our photo. He smiles and waves, then leans over to one of the booth employees and says something to him. The guy comes through the crowd and asks my wife to follow him. She walks all the way up to Stan and he talks with her for a minute or two and signs the photo. His mannerisms were so different toward my wife than they were to the people getting the guitars because this was something that was special to us. It has no monetary value. https://imgur.com gallery kgnslwt.
Unit 7 says Excelsior.
Thimblefire says I remember his wife bursting out during an interview about how he would write poetry to her daily. She expressed how good a husband and friend he was to her and I feel it important to not overlook that. Ill miss him. He encouraged creativity in his fans and to my knowledge never judged anyone over a dislike of their creativity. He was just a darn good dude and I'm happy we had him as long as we did. Thank you.
Mandatory fun escape. He says Stan, the heroes you imagined may have been only that, but you used them to make the world a better place for so many people. We miss you already. Godspeed, and thank you. Muffy says the saddest thing about this is hearing the news of those closest to him trying to coerce money from him. I died and read too much of it, but it's always disappointing to hear. Regardless. 95 is a grand age, but he's also left a lasting impact on comics, TV and film. Couldn't have asked for better really. Thanks Stan.
Hot Kettle BLK says every F is a Yondu-style Ravager firework in the cosmos for Stan.
Magneto says one day, when I was a kid, my brother and I walked down the road to the nearest gas station to buy some candy. That's where I saw Wizard magazine, 34, for the first time, which featured on its cover an illustration of Rogue and Psylocke of the X-Men. I was somewhat familiar with Batman, Spider-Man, and Superman, but I really didn't know of any female superheroes aside from Wonder Woman, who frankly seemed pretty lame to me as a kid. At that time, I bought the magazine, and for months, it was an obsession for me. I read it over and over again. I started buying comic books, drawing characters, reading the stories out loud in the voices I imagined each character to have, dreaming up new powers and imagining new worlds. What I loved about the Marvel Universe was that there was room for everybody. Men, women, people of different races, nationalities, ages, abilities, and backgrounds. It made me feel like comic books were something that everyone could enjoy. I shared my love for comic books with my brother. Although he struggled in school and teachers couldn't get him to focus, he would pay attention when I read the Uncanny X-Men to him, and when he finally learned to read, it was because of comic books. Thanks to Stan Lee for showing us that anyone can be a hero. R.I.P.
Roast Beef Disease says Stan Lee was a cool guy. He used to come to my elementary school every year during the Boone Fair, and I still have no clue why my Midwest school was so special, but I know kindergarten till 6th grade he came for one day. And I met him every time.
Gooplam88 says he taught me through his stories characters to be me, to not worry what anyone thinks about me. Stan Lee taught me that being yourself is better than being no one, that being yourself is what makes a hero a hero. I never met him but I lost a father today.
Ocean J says Stan deserves a funeral procession down the entire length of Madison Avenue, NY, lying in honor in the back of Thor's chariot, escorted by Spider-Man and all of his characters. For his singular impact on global culture, the entire city should shut down. Excelsior.
Unix says he made my imagination soar. I roamed the galaxy with the Silver Surfer, challenged the gods with Thor, explored the seas with Namor and felt the loneliness and isolation of the Hulk, and X200B.
The symbiotic boy says my dad, who's past 60 now, grew up reading Stan's comics, and I grew up like many children with a Spider-Man obsession. I remember pretending to be sick so I could stay home and watch my animated Spider-Man VHS that I got for Christmas. I'd watched it 1,000 times, but it was still so worth it to put my head against the radiator to simulate a fever just to vicariously experience that feeling of heroism and fantasy. And I'd cough whenever my mum came in to check on me. It's just incredible the sheer quantity of dreams which passed from this man's imagination into the hearts and lives of children and their parents and their grandparents. In a very cynical age, his creations continue to inspire and capture the greatest parts of the imagination. I can't count how many times I have laid in bed at night and pictured myself alongside his characters. What a magnificent legacy. Excelsior, Stan.
Life Death Studios says it made me sick how much karma grinding was going on over the legend's dead body. I know I'm late to it, but Stan Lee will always be in my heart, god damn it.
She's dead. Jim says, man, this sucks. I grew up on his movies, reading his comics. I hope he's having fun up there with his creations. Rest in peace to a truly great man.
Windia Singer 12 says, I've always liked Stan Lee's name. It sounds like Stanley, but isn't it? It's cool. A nice thing I like to think about is if his name is actually Stanley Lee, and he just calls himself Stan for short. Whether or not his name is actually Stan or Stanley, he will be missed.
Inner P.I. says, if it wasn't for his comics, I never would have picked up a pencil, found art, fallen in love with drawing, gone to art school, which led me to photography, which led me to starting my own business. He also introduced art concepts to my young adult self, taught me the love of reading and imagination. His comics changed my life.
Easy MC Sleazy says, you die twice, once when your heart stops and the second when someone says your name for the last time. Stan Lee will never die and will always be a beacon for what it means to be a real-life superhero. F.
Devon says he lived a long life filled with love, laughter and bringing joy to millions. We all should be so lucky.
Nitsuko says, this is so surreal. Some people you simply can't imagine dying. Rest in peace.
Kim Jong-un 4 says, I'm by no means a big comic book fan, but I've always loved the character of Spider-Man, and the shows and movies he's been in. I know that Lee can't read this, but I want him to know that his wonderful writing and beautiful imagination struck a chord with me, and still does. Rest in peace.
Aldini Joker says, I didn't meet him personally, but I was front and center at an intimate event in which he and Kevin Smith had a conversation about everything. And X200B, Stan Lee had so much charisma it was astounding. Like, presidential level charisma.
Deleted, says, deleted.
Battlepig 101 says, you know we did this right. https://www.reddit.com/r/askreddit/comment/e9iwv2r s equals joj1 and she equals 1f369,743. Queen Slayer says, we're one day away from Endgame and the last Stan Lee cameo. I will cherish it. Thank you Mr. Lee for all those superheroes that still and always will have a huge part in our lives.
John 550 says, according to my footlocker full of old Marvel comics that I refuse to throw away, despite my girlfriend's protests, Stan Lee was the fucking man. His artistic business prowess in life ensures he'll continue to touch many young people's lives for years to come. Thanks, Stan.
Roy Nudgemok says, my first SD Comic-Con, I ran into him kinda. He was being escorted outdoors, along the main glass hallway where all the talks were happening. It was so hot, and he was wearing his signature yellow sweater vest and keeping pace with his assistants. I couldn't believe my eyes. I was just hanging outside, and there he was, steady as he goes. I yelled at him the only thing I could, I love you Stan. I didn't expect him to hear me since there was a good amount of distance between us and he was hurrying to his panel, The Amazing Stan Lee. But no, with double-barrel fingers towards me, not missing a beat, that firm, unmistakable Stan voice we all have grown accustomed to all these years. I hear, love you too. Many years later me and 3 friends go for a group photo. There was a kid before us, and Stan made sure to take time with the young boy and not let the photographs rush by a moment. Once our photo was taken, I noticed how smaller he was now, not weak, but small like my own grandma. Instead of thanking him, I just told him I loved him. He didn't hear me, but it didn't matter. Out of all the stories and heroes and villains he gave us, Stan was the truest hero and champion of our hearts and imaginations. Stan was the man. He never let us down, and in his memory we should try to be like Stan, ever moving, bending, steadfast, and fighting for the future for ourselves and others in ways that we can edit. Last thoughts.
Deleted, says FFS. Earlier today I was on that thread of Who Are You Surprised is still alive and numerous people mentioned Stan.
Your mom's Orcrix says I lived for Saturday morning X-Men in the early 90s. Thank you Stan for whatever you had to do with that.
The Handsome Edge says the most heartbreaking part of Avengers 4 will be the part where they show the words R.I.P. Stan Lee at the end of the movie. Crying face.
Flo Flossquid says I am not an expert in any way, shape or form when it comes to comics, etc. My boyfriend told me that Stan Lee makes cameos in the movies and I remember the first time I recognized him. I was so excited. R.I.P.
QCO Vincent says 95 years of good.